Welcome back to another episode of Pushing Over the Box. Today I'm so excited to be talking to Erika Mayall, previously a dancer herself, currently licensed physiotherapist. Erika specializes in dancers and artistic athletes and has a podcast of her own where she shares tips and education about common injuries and how to deal with them. I can't wait to talk to her, so let's get right into it. Hi Erika, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, my first question is, when did you start dancing and what styles did you train in growing up?
Yeah, so I started dancing when I was about 2.5, probably. I have an older sister and she was dancing, and so I would go along to the studio with my mom when my sister had class and would kind of be dancing around the sides and stuff. And so the teacher one day was like, why doesn't she just join the class? So I was pretty little. I was not yet 3 when I started and trained mostly in ballet when I was really young, and then as I got older, I added more styles and trained in modern and tap and jazz and musical theater and a few other styles, but ballet and modern were sort of the main styles I trained in. And then when I was a bit older, a little bit of contemporary as well, but we did, at the studio I grew up at, we did more modern than contemporary.
Did you have a favorite style when you were growing up?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think ballet's probably always been my favorite, or maybe sort of contemporary, like when I was a bit older, but that's always been like the most consistent. I enjoyed other styles as well, but yeah, ballet's always been a favorite.
In your early training, were you often injured or?
Not necessarily. When I was younger, like much younger, I didn't have any injuries. And then when I was a teenager, I did have a few injuries. Nothing that was super serious. I didn't have any injuries that kept me out of dance for really long periods of time. But I did have some issues with some tendonitis in my feet when I was probably started when I was about like 13 or 14 maybe, and so I sort of dealt with that on and off, and that was actually my introduction to physiotherapy, was that I went to a physical therapist for treatment of my feet when I was a teenager. And then I at one point also broke one of my toes, so that was another injury. That was actually probably the one that kept me out of dance, or at least off point, the longest. But other than that, I didn't have a lot of injuries growing up.
Do you feel like when you were training that having pain while dancing was normalized?
To a certain degree, yes. I think there was a lot of that mentality of kind of no pain, no gain, or sort of like pushing through things a little bit. So yeah, I don't remember a lot of my teachers like explicitly saying things like that, but I think it was the culture of it, or there was a lot of sort of back in our day, we would have done X, Y, Z. And so it was like a little bit of, like a cultural sort of norm. There wasn't a ton of pressure from my direct teachers to keep dancing if we were in pain and things like that, but certainly the culture around it was there for sure.
When did you first discover that physiotherapy might be something you would want to transition into instead of becoming a professional dancer?
Yeah, so a little bit like when I was kind of 13, 14, sort of that age with my first experiences, I kind of was like, oh, this is like a cool profession. I was interested in what the therapists were doing. And then as I continued sort of through high school and started sort of researching what do I want to do after in terms of university programs and things like that, I discovered kinesiology, and that immediately I was like, oh, that sounds so cool, like studying how the body moves and the muscles and all of that. So it was while I was still in high school that I knew I was interested in like that area of study. I still wasn't 100% sure I was necessarily going to go into physiotherapy at that point, because I was also interested in sports medicine and I was interested in dance teaching as well. So there was a few different things, but a lot of those kind of intersected.
Yeah. And how do you think that your background as a dancer helped influence your approach to PT-related things?
Yeah, so I think dancers have a really great ability of understanding movement and are often really good at even watching other people move. So in the studio, like maybe you're watching yourself in the mirror, but also watching your friends and your peers or teachers are demonstrating, and you're like copying those movements. So I think that background in dance really, really helped my ability to analyze how people are moving and maybe see where there's like potentially issues with how they're moving or faults in how they're moving or things that might be contributing to like pain or injury. So I think that was a huge contributor from my dance background, that I was really used to analyzing movement and seeing how people moved.
And how was it transitioning from being a dancer into focusing more on your studies and college and things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I did my undergraduate degree in kinesiology. So once I discovered that that was like an option, and the school that I went to, we had a requirement that you had to do a certain number of sports courses per kind of term. And so each year you had to take 4 different sports. And we had the ability to, like, there was kind of an option of replacing those sports courses with dance courses, like from the dance department. And so I actually did almost all of my sport credits as dance classes in my undergrad. So although I wasn't a dance major, I was still taking a lot of dance classes. And I think that really helped my transition because it was different than what I had been doing previously in terms of, you know, working towards exams or competitions or things like that. But I still got to be in the studio and dance and apply a lot of what I was learning in my kinesiology degree. Like I could then kind of go in the studio and think about it in that regard or from that perspective. So I think it was a really nice transition that I was out of like a really intensive dance environment, but I still got to like dance and experience that. And it was still probably my primary movement practice. Yeah. I still had to do some sports because we had to have a certain number of sport requirements to graduate. So I still had to do like an aquatic sport and a racket sport and things like that. But I did get to take a lot of dance courses as well.
And how are you able to balance academics with dance and ballet?
I mean, I think, well, so when I was in high school, I think it was a little bit harder actually, just because the 2 things were almost kind of separate. And so it was like you're going to school all day, and then when most people would be going home and doing homework, then I was like going to the studio and dancing really long hours. I was quite fortunate in high school that school always came fairly naturally to me, so I didn't necessarily have to study too hard, if that makes sense. So I was certainly completing all my work and I was a good student, but it came fairly naturally to me. It wasn't super hard for me. When I was in university, that was definitely a little bit more challenging just because the demands are so much higher on your time. But at that point, I wasn't dancing as much. And then the dance classes were actually some of my university credits. So it was easy because it was like in my course schedule throughout the week. So it was a little bit of a better balance in terms of having those courses be part of my university program.
And did you know that you always wanted to specialize in dancers?
Yeah, as soon as I decided that like physio was probably the path that I was interested in and wanted to go down that route, I always had an idea that I wanted to still be involved in the dance industry. When I was going to physio when I was in high school, there weren't, at least in my area, there weren't people who specialized in dance. So I was just going to a regular like sports PT, and they were great, but they didn't necessarily understand dance. And so especially with having like a foot injury, they didn't really know what point work was or what the like physical demands of point work were. So I knew that there was sort of a gap in the market, if you will, or like an area where there was a lot of potential for somebody who understood dancers. And so it was something that I think as soon as I knew that that was the path I wanted to go down, I had like an idea that, oh, wouldn't it be cool if I could be that physio that like didn't exist when I was younger and be able to provide that service.
Yeah, because it's really annoying when you have to explain to a PT what you're doing and they don't really understand.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be frustrating for sure. Or they'll just say, well, like, why don't you just not put your legs so high? And you're like, well, because I have to.
Yeah. What would you say makes treating dancers different from treating other athletes?
Ooh, that's a great question. There's a couple of things that make them different. Number one, I would say dancers, and this is one of the reasons I love working with dancers so much, is dancers are really in tune with their body. So when dancers come in, they will often say, I have like this thing that hurts when I do this specific thing and it feels exactly like this. Like they almost know a little bit like what's going on, or they're like really precise about feeling like this, you know, when I'm on this angle, I can feel it like this, but if I change this, then it feels different or whatever. And so you get really, really good information from dancers. They're really in tune with their bodies and kind of can give you really good information. So I love that about working with dancers. Dancers are also really highly motivated. And so I don't have to spend a lot of time like convincing people to do their exercises or things like that. Most of the time it's like the opposite. I'm actually like, okay, we need to do a little bit less and sort of like spend more time educating around that. But that also is a little bit different than a lot of other populations of people you might treat, where you spend more time trying to like convince them to follow through with the treatment and stuff. But dancers are really highly motivated a lot of times. And then the other thing that's definitely very different treating dancers versus the general population is just the demands of flexibility and some of the like aesthetic demands too. In other sports, if you're working with other athletes, it doesn't often matter if it looks pretty when they're doing something. So if they're interested in strength or power or sometimes flexibility, but it doesn't necessarily matter what it looks like. But with dance, we need to achieve certain things, but it also has to look a certain way. And so that's really different when you're dealing with dancers or working with dancers, that it's not just like, okay, we need to be able to jump this high or whatever. It's like, we need to be able to jump this high with pointed feet and good alignment and straight leg, like whatever it is. And so it's very different from like an aesthetic perspective.
Yeah. Would you say that you consider dance as more of a sport or more of a form of art?
Ooh, that's such a tough question. So as a physio, I would say when I'm thinking about it and when I'm treating dancers, I definitely consider it a little bit more of like a sport, or at least like an athletic endeavor, if that makes sense. So like we really try and frame it in terms of like dancers are athletes, they're artistic athletes, but they are athletes, because I think if we don't think of dancers that way, we do them a bit of a disservice in terms of downplaying how physically demanding dance actually is. But obviously it is an art form. So you could have all of the like athletic qualities of a dancer, and that still doesn't necessarily like mean that you're going to make it as a professional or that type of thing, because there's the artistic element on top of it. So when I'm watching dance and if I'm going to performances or even when I'm dancing myself, I definitely think of it more as an art form. But in terms of my work, I think you have to approach it a little bit from a more athletic perspective so that we know that we're meeting the physical demands, whether that's strength or flexibility or power or endurance or whatever it is.
What would you say is the most common injury that you see?
That's a great question. So from the research, we know that foot and ankle injuries are the most common injuries that we see in dancers. And I would say that's probably true in my practice as well, that I see like a pretty high percentage of foot and ankle injuries. But I also see a really high percentage of hip injuries in dancers as well, which the research also shows that there's high percentages of like hip injuries too. But if I had to pick between the two, like probably foot and ankle does win out a little bit, but we do see a lot of hip issues as well.
Mm-hmm. And what inspired you to start the Dance Physio podcast?
Great question. I don't think I've ever been asked that before. I really like talking. And so for me, like a spoken medium or like something where you can communicate with people in that way made sense. I have a mentor who really likes podcasting. And so she, for a really long time, was trying to convince me to start a podcast. Years before I actually started one, she had said, you should do a podcast. And so that was part of like the push to do it. But I think it's just, I find it easier to communicate in spoken words versus say social media posts. Like I don't love filming reels or things like that. Like I find that a lot harder to come up with creative ideas and stuff. And so I knew that I wanted to be able to reach a wider audience and like educate people and share the information and ideas and stuff with a wider audience. And a lot of people do that through social media platforms. But for me, I just really liked the podcast platform because I felt like it allowed a little bit of a longer form content, and speaking just came more natural.
How do you choose the topics for your episodes?
A variety of ways. I think some of them just pop into my head. A lot of it's inspired by what goes on clinically. Like I'll sometimes have a week where I'm like, oh, I saw a lot of like this particular injury this week. And so that sometimes is what inspires a podcast episode, or conversations that I'm having in the clinic, like that often sort of come about seasonally. Like people will be like, oh, it's audition season, and they'll have questions about that, or competition season, or summer break, or things like that. So a lot of the topics are just inspired by conversations I'm having in the clinic on a daily basis. A lot also, people send in requests. I'll get messages, or sometimes I'll put up stories on social media or things like that and say, if you have any requests for topics, send them in. And so I do have like a running kind of list that I keep of things that people have requested topic-wise. And then sometimes they are responding maybe a bit to things that are happening in the world, and a lot of like social media. Like there might be something that happens in social media that kind of blows up and becomes like a bit of a talking point. And so I might address that like in a podcast episode as well. So a few different things that inspire them, but yeah.
Are there any myths about dance training that you really try to challenge on your podcast?
I think there's a few, and I think one that we kind of touched on a little bit is that sort of idea that dancers aren't athletes, or that dance is like inherently different than other athletic endeavors. And so a lot of the topics are very kind of sports sciencey based, or like dance sciencey based, but inspired from sports science topics. So I think that's something that we're like constantly trying to, sort of reframe and address on the podcast. Something that comes up time and time and time again, and people are probably sick of me talking about it, but I talk a lot about the idea of periodization and like training cycles, and how we need to incorporate like rest and recovery into dance training. And so that's definitely something, because I think in the dance world there's often this idea that like more is better, and so there's more rehearsals, more practices, more performances, more training, more competitions, and really a lot of the times we actually need to pull back and focus a bit more on rest and recovery. So that's certainly something that we try and address on the podcast as well.
Yeah. Why do you think that the mindset of dancing through pain still exists?
That's a loaded question. I mean, I think there's just so much tradition in the dance world. So much of what we do in dance is rooted in tradition. And when we talk to teachers or choreographers or company directors or people like that and ask, about certain trends or like why things are done the way they are, so often the answer given is just, well, that's how it's always been done. And so I think this idea of like training through pain is really deeply rooted in the dance world. And so teachers who maybe are now teaching, they grew up with that, and maybe they've just not stopped to examine that kind of like mindset or that philosophy. And so it's a little bit of just like being perpetuated mostly because of tradition. I think like we in the dance world are very hesitant to break from tradition, and there's a lot of pride that's kind of rooted in the tradition of dance and the history of especially ballet, other styles of dance absolutely for sure. So I think that plays a really big role, and so it's hard to change those cultural things. Like it's so deeply rooted in the culture of dance. It is absolutely starting to change, but I think it's just hard, and it's like a bit of a slow process to change that mindset because of how based in tradition everything is.
What would you say is the most harmful thing that younger dancers are doing? For example, like foot stretchers or like overstretching or something like that.
Yeah, I think in terms of, across the board, what we see is a lot of the really extreme stretching practices that we're seeing. So overstretching is like part of it for sure, but even just some of the other extreme, I call them kind of extreme stretching practices, but that could even just be people like holding stretches for really long periods of time, even if it's not an overstretch, but they're just like sitting in the splits and doing their homework for an hour or something like that. So these like really long sustained stretches can definitely be harmful. And then like you said, those like overstretching and a lot of that like really extreme stretching, and especially extreme stretching when dancers maybe don't have the strength to like control through those ranges. I would say that's probably the most harmful thing that we still see a lot in the dance world, and it's often like really glorified in the dance world. So again, if we see social media posts of somebody doing something with like these huge amounts of flexibility, it often gets a lot of likes and shares. And so this idea of like, oh, I need to also be able to achieve that kind of gets perpetuated as well. So I think that's probably the most harmful thing we see among younger dancers for sure.
What would you say for a younger dancer who has extreme ranges of flexibility and in just a normal stretch they wouldn't feel anything? What should they do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So really, if somebody is kind of like, I'm going to call them like sort of naturally flexible, but oftentimes that comes along with like hypermobility or things like that, they often won't feel a lot of stretching in kind of normal ranges of motion. Dancers like that need a lot of strength. And so what we often will end up doing is really focusing on like working on strength, and especially strength through range. And so instead of just thinking about going into a stretch position, it's like, can you control, or like, do you have the strength to move through that whole range of motion? So an example of that would be somebody who could like shoulder their leg super easily, and they're like, I don't feel a stretch, it feels totally fine when they're like holding onto their leg. But if they let go of their leg, it like drops down, 6 inches or a foot or whatever. And so in a dancer like that, instead of, focusing on, okay, how do we feel more of a stretch or how do we get more of a stretch, they probably don't need more flexibility if they can easily get into that position, but we want to focus on the strength for them to be able to control all the way up to that position so that they don't have to use their arm to like keep their leg there.
What would you say is one recommendation for teachers to create a safer training environment?
So many recommendations. I think if I had to like narrow it down to one thing, I think centering the student and their experience and like prioritizing that dancer's longevity is like probably the single most important thing, because a lot of times I think some of the extreme things that happen within a dance studio are because we want like instantaneous success, or we want to sort of push, especially kids who are really talented at a young age. It's really easy to try and say like, okay, let's try and push them further and further and further, but at some point that can actually be probably a bit detrimental because maybe they don't have like the physical maturity. And so it's like thinking about the long term, like where do we want this dancer to be when they're 20 years old, when they're 30 years old. Like we want them to have longevity in their careers. And so thinking more about the long game as opposed to kind of that like here and now, knowing that that's going to keep them healthier and safer in their career.
And what advice would you give to dancers who want long careers?
Strength train. I think that's the one thing that's like often missing in dance training programs, or historically has been. It's much more common. Dancers are starting to do more strengthening, but I think if we want long careers and we want to think about longevity in those careers, the stronger we can be, the kind of overall better off your body is going to be. If I had to also, throw something else in there, I would definitely say considering that idea of periodization. So having periods of time off throughout the season and having times where we're pushing more and dancing more, and then times where we're focusing more on rest and recovery. And strength training or just conditioning in general fits into that whole cycle of periodization. So if we can embrace that more in the dance world and not be training like year round, like 12 months of the year, that really, really helps with longevity in careers as well.
And what would you say to dancers who feel like if they rest, it's them falling behind?
Yeah, and that's such a hard sort of like myth or misconception to break. And I mean, some people like evidence or research, and there's studies that have actually looked at dancers who have taken 8 weeks off in the summer, and then they've measured their strength and their flexibility and all of these things. They've measured them before they've taken time off, and then they've measured them like immediately when they come back after having a break of like 8 weeks. And those measurements actually have improved in those dancers because rest and recovery is so important for the body. And so I think sometimes dancers need like kind of hard evidence like that, but also if dancers do take a break from dance, and even if it's not 8 weeks, maybe they take 4 weeks off or something like that, most dancers will come back and be like I actually feel like I can jump higher, my body feels refreshed, I feel like I have more energy. And so sometimes it's like you almost have to convince them in reverse, like they need to go through it and experience it and feel in their own body. So that's one thing, is like really just showing that the evidence is there to show that we need rest and recovery. But I think the other thing too, in terms of like dancers feeling like they're falling behind, is to remember that every dancer is on their own journey. And so everybody is going to peak at different times and have different sort of like highs and different lows in their training and in their career journey. So just because one of your friends is maybe off at a summer intensive and you're taking the summer off doesn't necessarily mean at the end of the day you're not both going to get to your end goals. Like everybody kind of, has different cycles and peaks at different times. And so just remembering that you're on your own journey and trying not to compare to other people around you.
And when dancers are taking time off, would you recommend them to do absolutely like nothing and just rest, or like still doing some like strength training or some exercises?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it depends a bit on how much time dancers have off. So if we, in like an ideal world, and this doesn't happen most of the time, but if we had, say, 2 months off as like an off season, like we'll call it off season a lot of the time, we want like the first probably 2 weeks of that to be like just probably doing nothing, like just resting, recovering from the season, kind of just, enjoy your life, go on vacation, do whatever. But then the rest of that time, we do want to be focusing on some conditioning. And so usually that is going to look like strength training and often cardiovascular training as well, so that you're doing training programs and working on physical conditioning, but not necessarily dance movement. So we're not using all of our dance muscles, we're using all of our other muscles to kind of cross train. A lot of times dancers don't get really long breaks like that. And so if they only get, 2 weeks off in the entire year, then we're probably going to prioritize just fully resting during that break if it's like such a short period of time. So in an ideal world, we'll have a long enough break that we have time for both. The first part of it's going to be rest, and then we're going to work on the conditioning side of things.
And if a dancer was injured and has to take time off, would you also recommend a format like that, or would you recommend still doing training for other parts of the body that might not be injured?
Yeah, so it depends a bit on the injury, because each injury is a little bit individual, but for the most part, what we want is to, continue to focus on exercises and conditioning for the rest of the body. So things that you might still be able to do. Maybe it's, I don't know, like you broke your foot and so you have a boot on and you can't do like stuff in standing or stuff with the foot, but we can focus on working on core exercises and upper body strengthening and working on turnout strengthening, and like there's lots of stuff you still can do. So we always want to try and keep dancers like as engaged as possible with whatever their limitations for their injury are. That being said, if it's a dancer where the injury is maybe related to overtraining, so I'm thinking about like instances like a stress fracture or something like that, where it's been like, kind of a little bit of a slow build due to overtraining, we might prioritize a bit more rest in those situations just to try and allow the body to have the reserves necessary to be able to heal the injury. So it's always going to be a little bit individual, but usually we're trying to encourage doing as much as possible within the kind of constraints of the injury.
Mm-hmm. And what advice would you give your 13-year-old self?
Oh, great question. I think I would just say enjoy the process and know that even if having a professional career or going into like performing isn't what you want, you can still stay involved in the dance world and really be like embedded in the dance world, and that it's going to give back to you much, much, much more than you ever like gave to it. So I think when I was sort of I loved it so much, but I kind of knew that like performing wasn't necessarily what I wanted, like a professional performing career. Yeah. And so I think at that point, I didn't have a lot of examples of other careers in dance that weren't either becoming a teacher or performing. And so, I think I would just say like, trust the process, stay with it. You'll discover something else that is going to keep you involved in the dance world, but be like really, really fulfilling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if one big change could happen in the dance world, what would you want it to be?
I get asked this question a lot, and I think the thing that I always come back to is that I would love to see there be regulation within the dance world. So right now, the dance industry, and a lot of people aren't aware of this, but the dance industry is like not at all regulated. So anybody who wants can open a dance studio and start training dancers and say that they're like a master dance teacher or whatever, even if they've never danced a day in their life. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, we do see people who are maybe like not using safe training practices or things like that, or dancers that aren't being treated well. And we see this across the board, like maybe with kids, but also professional dancers who aren't being, treated well in professional contracts or paid enough or things like that. So I would just say, I think if we can regulate the dance industry and have like a little bit more structure within the industry, similar to what we see in some other sports settings, I think we would see a lot of change happen across the board, whether it's, payment of dancers or access to healthcare or training practices and stuff. So I think regulation would be my big thing I would change if I could.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I learned so much.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me.